Hi, I'm Jim Knotts, President and CEO of the Vietnam Veterans Memorial Fund. Welcome to today's virtual reading of the names. 2022 marks the 40th anniversary of the dedication of the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington, D.C. As part of our commemoration, we'll host an in-person reading of the names at the wall from November 7th through 10th, 2022, when all 58,281 names on the wall will be read aloud. In the lead up to that event, we'll be reading names each day online while sharing the photos of these heroes. For our daily virtual reading, the names of the service members will be read by month and day of death between the years 1956 and 1975 in alphabetical order for the given day. We apologize in advance for any mispronunciations. Know that our readers are doing their best to honor these service members. We hope you'll listen and watch each day and share with others as we remember and honor those who gave their lives during the Vietnam War.
Bert Morris Adams III, Gerald David Ayton, Lyle Ernest Allen, Jr., Robert Eugene Anderson, Willie Austin, Jr., Michael Henry Ball, Dixie Carl Berger, Edgar Davidson Berner, Edward James Bishop, Jr., Ben Stanley Biddle, Tommy Lee Boatwright, James Albert Boda, Robert Sidney Boggs, Leo Sidney Boston, Terrell Edward Bradford, Lauren Eugene Bradley, Paul DeWitt Brannon, Paul Andrew Browse, Wendell Lee Brown, Gerald Ray Brown, Thomas Edward Brown, Anthony George Brozick, Donald William Bruce, Jr., David Moy Burke, Jr., Gary Allen Burks, Elmo Larry Butler, Willard Sparks Cannon III, Lewis Edward Cantrell, Roger Dale Caudle, John Schlua, Walter Kurt Clark, James William Cleary, Ronald David Cobb, Thomas Stanley Cook, Larry Odell Copeland, Ronald Edward Kritzer, Joseph Aguihi Cruz, James Earl Cunningham, Paul Leo Sear, William Grant Daly, Jr., Gary Leonard Daniels, Simon Dean, Jr., Donnie Ray DeHart, Charles Philip DiTomaso, Francis Thomas Dillon, Mark Hannay Dixon, James William Dodd, Lester Earl Downing, John Turner Dunlap III, William Patrick Egan, Ronald Lee Evans, Louis Anthony Favuza, Daniel Edward Feck, Richard James Fisher, Robert Morris Flanagan, John Frederick Fleming, Victor James Ford, Robert Enoch Foster, Jr., Frederick Edward Furr, Stephen Michael Gabries, Edward Albert Gaffney, Joseph Gradell, David D. Gamir, Irwin John Harder,
Harry Donald Haskins, William George Hasselman, Ronald L. Hazen, Kenneth Eugene Helms, Harold Hennessy, James Alfred Herring, Dennis Wayne Hunter, Harley John Jenks, James Allen Jensen, Andrew John Joby, Leroy Johnson, Charles Edward Johnson, Robert William Johnson, Jr., Arthur Lee Jordan, Darwin Lee Judge, Darrell Lee Cados, Richard Leon Keller, Jeffrey John Claves, Lawrence Douglas Knuth, Paul John Rosank, Joseph Thomas Kovaloff, Jack Coury, Paul Joseph Landry, Sidney Daniel Lane, Jr., George Lathan, David Gale Ledgerwood, James Arthur Livingston, J. Leslie Lieberman, Roy Lawless Lipscomb, Robert Lester Long, Luciano Gutierrez Lopez, Robert Brewster Lowe, Edward Richard Luff, Jr., Joseph Anthony Magg, Jr., Gary Lee Mack, Elmer Martin, David Lynn Massa, George Lee Mockin, Sr., Dennis Arnold May, Albert McCoy, Jr., George William McDaniel, James William McGuire, Charles McMahon, Jr., Arthur F. McCade, Jr., Ted Roger Miller, James Ronnie Mollett, Huriel Lee Moore, Anthony Lewis Moore, Dennis Edward Morgan, Wallace Jerome Mosley, John James Mott, William Francis Mullen, Donald L. Musselman, Vernon Walter Nix III, Thomas Allen Neustrom, William Craig Nystil, Michael Joseph O'Keefe, Patrick O'Reilly Orr, Jose Hector Ortiz, Carl Eugene Patton, Lloyd William Peel, Jr., Louis Joseph Pellizzari, Adolfo Moreno Perez, Willard Alton Perry, Jr.,
Charles Russell Petchnick, Bob Elia Pogre, George John Pollan, Joseph John Polonco, Jr., Walter Glenn Pope, James Willard Powers, Jr., Walter Lee Pumpelly, Andrew Brian Rankin, Dennis Michael Ray, Jose Fermin Rivera Barreto, William Arthur Rohr, Francisco Rodriguez, Jr., Anthony Sanseverino, William John Sattler III, John Charles Seal, Clinton William Shaver, Jr., Michael John Shea, Charles Irvin Shelton, Clint Joseph Sims, Roy Harrison Snyder, Laura William Snyder, Felix F. Soto, Elmer Lynn Spivey, Lorenzo Stegall, Jasper Stevens, Jr., Mark Lane Stevenson, David Stevens, Jr., Richard Stewart, William John Steve, Arthur Ronald Strahan, David Francis Strickler, Alexander Tate, Jr., Ansel James Terry, Jerry Elmer Thompson, Terry Neal Thompson, Robert Paul Tidwell, Michael Joseph Tridico, James Walter Tuttle, Thomas Lionel Twyford, Clifford Earl Tyson, Linwood Alferonia Walker, James Edward Walker, Jr., Douglas Delano Wallace, Wilbert Eugene Waxton, Wilson Lewis Webb, Jr., Robert Hyatt Westcott, Jr., David Vernon Winnery, Marvin Ray White, Lucky Galen White, Stephen Robert White, Julian B. Willoughby, James Clyde Whisker, Gary Wisnier, Frederick Edward Wortman, Gary Lee Young.